Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you today. I hope that you're all doing well. It's somewhere, probably around the age of 3 or 4, children begin to ask a very short, yet very powerful and often befuddling question. It's the question of why. Why is the sky blue? Well, because blue particles in the water particles in the sky reflect blue light. Daddy, why do they do that? Well, God created them that way. Daddy, why did he create it that way? I don't know. Daddy, why don't you know? And on the questions tend to go. But that why question, it never really stops. It just kind of keeps going on. We learn when to ask the questions and when not to ask the questions. And the questions begin to change. But even on into adulthood, the why questions begin to occur and continue to occur. And it seems that our brains are even wired that way. We want to know the answer to why. So much so that many of us, when we have a little bit of information, our brains will then fill in the blank spaces. You've done this with your friends and your family before, most likely, and you've had it done to you, where you learned something about your friend or your family, or they did something, and then you rush to assume. You assumed, well, they must have done this because of this, and you filled in the blank. You wanted to know why. That our brains are wired in such a way, we want to know why, and when we don't actually know why, we then begin to try and fill in the blanks with our own imagination so that we can know why. We all want to know why. Even when it comes to spirituality, we all have questions. Why? Why any of this? Why did God do any of this? Why does he care about us? Why did he sacrifice his son? And yes, we have answers, but nevertheless, we still find ourselves asking why. And there are times we don't really understand. Why did God do as he did? Why did he do it in this way instead of that way? Why has this occurred instead of that occurring? We all have questions. And today I want us to examine what we are to do with those questions. The times when we don't understand. For some questions are, okay, I'd like to know why, but no, I'm okay moving forward not knowing why. But some questions are deep, and we really don't understand, why did God choose to do it this way? Or why is this happening in my life? What are we to do when we don't understand? And today, I want us to look at the tale of two different questions, two different characters, Jonah and Job, both of whom are going to ask a why question that we continue to ask today, though it might take us a minute to identify exactly what that why question is. But they're both going to ask a question of why, desiring to understand why God has done what he's done, why he's doing what he's doing. And then we're going to look at what they did with that question, how they interacted with that question. And I believe that as we look at these two examples, we can get an idea of what we should do with our why question, what we should do when we just don't understand. And the first character we're going to look at is the character of Job. And to do that, we're going to need our Bibles. I wonder, how many Bibles do we have today? What a fantastic sight. Today we're going to be in Job, and we're going to be in Jonah, and we're going to kind of jump around between a couple different texts. And the first one is going to be in Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1. Because to understand the story of Job, we kind of have to know a little bit of the backstory. To understand the question that he's asking and why he's asking it, we kind of need to know what was going on behind the scenes. So we're going to look at verses 6 through 12. Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 12. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, and that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now it's important to realize that Job, we're never told he ever finds out about this particular scenario. So we have some privy to some background information that Job does not have. For what's about to happen, if you remember the story, is Satan does reach out and strike Job, or at least his family. And he loses all kinds of family. He loses all kinds of property. In fact, the only person who remains is his wife. And of course, we've all made jokes of, oh, but what about her wife, his wife? I mean, Satan said, I want to tempt you and I want to make your life horrible. And so he left her. I'm not sure if that's a joke we should make or not. But Satan strikes out and takes everything he has. But Job doesn't know that the reason why he's done that is because God has put him up as this is the epitome of what it means to be my follower. Job does not know that. Instead, all he knows is that he's been attacked. All he knows is that he's lost everything. And we get a glimpse into Job's psyche if we fast forward a little bit and look at Job chapter 30. Job chapter 30, and I know it's a little bit of a long reading, but we kind of need to get a glimpse as to what Job is saying, what he feels in order to understand his question. We're going to pick up in verse 19. God has cast me into the mire. This is Job speaking. And I have become like dust and ashes. I cry to you for help. You do not answer me. I stand and you only look at me. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. You lift up on the wind. You make me ride on it. And you toss me about in the roar of the storm. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. Yet does not one in a heap of ruin stretch out his hand and in distress cry for help? Did not I weep for him whose day was hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? But when I hoped for good, evil came. And when I waited for light, darkness came. My inward parts are in turmoil, never still. Days of affliction come to meet me. I go about darkened, but not by the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black and falls from me, and my bones burn with heat. My lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the voice of those who weep. Before we go on to chapter 31, do you hear what Job is saying? Do you hear the agony in his voice as he says, and he attributes it, God, you've done this to me. Look how I feel. I feel as though everything crumbles, even my skin crumbles off of me. Can you hear the agony and pain in his voice? I notice verse 31. I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? What would be my portion from God above, and my heritage from the Almighty on high? Is not calamity for the unrighteous, and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does not he see my ways and number all my steps? If I've walked with falsehood, and my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. If my step is turned aside from the way, and my heart is gone after my eyes, and if any spot is stuck on my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. There are no chapter distinctions in the original writing of Job. Instead, it flows one to the other. So Job asks questions, or Job describes his state, describes what he's feeling in chapter 30, and then moves to these questions in chapter 31. Did you notice what he asked? Verse 3, is not calamity for the unrighteous, and disasters for the workers of iniquity. And Job will go on to say, I haven't been unrighteous. I haven't done anything. I haven't looked at anybody wrong. I haven't treated anybody poorly. I haven't done anything wrong. In other words, Job's asking this question: why has this happened to me? Why has evil happened to me when I've done good? Why has the Lord struck me when I haven't done anything deserving of it? That's the question Job's asking. Why has this happened? And why to me? Sounds like a similar question that we hear amongst ourselves. Why has this happened to me? Why am I going through this right now? What's taking place in my life? Well, I don't think I deserve this. Why has this happened to me? And notice to whom Job asks. If we look back in chapter 30 and verse 19, God has cast me into the mire. And in verse 21, you have turned cruel to me. Verse 22, you lifted me up on the wind. Kind of sounds a little bit like a prayer, doesn't it? God, you've done this to me. Well, why? Why has this happened to me? It seems that in this moment, Job is offering a prayer, trying to figure out, trying to wrap his mind around what's happened. I feel like I'm in this pit and everything's just fallen apart for me and I don't really understand why. Why has this happened? Why have you let this happen? That's the question Job asks. I want you to notice what happens at the end in Job chapter 42. Job chapter 42 and verse 7. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." You've not spoken of me what was right. You've not spoken of me as my servant Job has. That what Job has said is declared to be right and even righteous in God's sight. And yet, Job, he's fairly blunt. Did you hear him in chapter 30? Why have you done this to me? I don't deserve this. Why have you done this to me? And yet he's declared to be righteous here in chapter 42. See, Job is an example of what we are to do when we don't understand. Because what makes Job righteous is not so much exactly what he says. In fact, some of what he says will be corrected by God. You didn't really understand what you said, did you? But what makes Job righteous is that he goes to God with what he doesn't understand. Is that he seeks God out and offers a prayer of, why have you done this to me? I don't think I deserve this. I don't think I did anything wrong. Why has this happened to me? It's not so much what Job said as to whom he said it to that resulted in God saying that he was righteous. I want us to look at the other character. That is the character of Jonah. And to do that, we've got to look at the book of Jonah. And so if you'll turn with me to Jonah chapter 1. Jonah chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 3 to begin with. Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come upon me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Many of us are familiar with the story of Jonah. And God comes to Jonah and says, "I want you to go to Nineveh, and I want you to preach, and I want you to let them know that danger is coming." And many of us are aware of Jonah's response. In fact, the text just told us his response. We're not really told why he chooses to do this, at least not yet. All we're told is that Jonah heard the voice of the Lord, heard what he was told to do, and then he heads off in the other direction. Now, if you went to Bible school like I did in Sunday school, then there's a high probability that at some point somebody asked the question, what made Jonah think he could flee from the presence of the Lord? How could he have been so stupid as to think he could flee? That's usually how the question goes. And yet, don't we sometimes find ourselves in the same boat? Haven't many Christians found themselves in the same boat? Where God says something and then the result is just to flee. But to understand why Job flees, we have to go towards the end of the book. That is in chapter 4. Chapter 4, because Jonah's going to give us his reasoning as to why he's done what he's done. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. For if you remember the story, Jonah flees. He finds himself on a boat. He finds himself in the water as a result of the storm that God has sent. And then God appoints a fish to swallow him up, where he spends 3 days, and he's going to be spit out. And then we're going to pick up right back where he left off. God comes to Jonah and says, "All right, are you ready to go now?" And then Jonah goes, and he goes part way in. And then we find out, after he's left, his reasoning behind everything that he did in chapter 4. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly. It displeased him because nothing happened in Nineveh. It displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful to slow anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? Did you catch why Jonah did why he did what he did? For I knew that you, that is God, I knew that you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, relenting from disaster. Jonah sounds a bit like a jerk, doesn't he? If ever there was a racist, it kind of sounds like Jonah, doesn't he? I don't want those people. But maybe it doesn't sound quite so bad when we consider who he's talking about. He's talking about the Assyrians. For the Assyrians live in Nineveh. And the Assyrians were a pretty brutal, bloodthirsty group. Now, they were known to flay their victims alive and take those skins and hang them over the city ramparts just to show how big and bad they were. They were known in their wake to impale people and set them up on stakes just so everybody could see. They were known, their prisoners, to put nose rings in their nose and lead them by those rings into slavery. And the nose ring was just so you keep up pace. They were a brutal, bloodthirsty group. In other words, the question Jonah asks is one that we ask too. The question he's asking is, why do the wicked seem to flourish when the good seem to perish? That's the question he's asking. He's asking, well, why is it that these people who continually attack and destroy everybody around them, why have you spared them? They're evil. Why are you having mercy upon them? The question Jonah asks is, why are you allowing evil people to flourish when those who seem to be good seem to suffer? Kind of sounds like a question we ask today, isn't it? Why is it that bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? And yet, Jonah's an example of what not to do. For Jonah has a very legitimate question, one that we ask still today. And yet Jonah takes off and flees from the presence of God and runs from the presence of God. Though eventually he will pray. And he will pray expressing the reality of how he feels. For within these two characters, we see a story of two different questions, two important questions, two legitimate questions, two questions that we still ask today, and yet two ways those questions are asked, prayed to God in very different arenas. Throughout this year, we're emphasizing the idea of prayer. Throughout this year, we're trying to focus in on how we should pray and when we should pray and what we should pray about. And today, we're going to look in terms of how should we pray. When should we pray? That is, we should pray when we encounter things that we don't understand. For both the story of Job and the story of Jonah are all about and focusing upon bringing Jonah and Job to a point where they would speak and pray with God. In the case of Job, he does it all on his own. That he takes his discomfort, his uncertainty, he takes his pain and takes it to God and says, God, why have you done this? And the whole story focuses upon how Job chooses to interact with God. In the case of Jonah, the whole story is about God trying to get Jonah to the point where he would express, this is what I feel and this is what I don't understand. For the entire text reads in terms of Jonah runs away and then God tries to bring him back so he can talk to him again so that Jonah will finally pray. And did you notice he only prays in chapter 4? That he finally prays at the end, and that's when God can finally address what's going on. But everything is about trying to bring Jonah, Job to a place where they might pray, might talk to God when they don't understand. And from both, they both have a similarity, that is, they both asked legitimate questions that they didn't understand. And both were to be brought to a point where they might interact with God and ask those questions. I want us to look at our text today, and we're not going to read verses 1 through 6. Instead, I want us to read verses 1 and 6. So if you read these with me, please. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And if you'll read with me verse 6. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. I want us to look back at this one. It's a definition of faith that we often use. That faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That the whole purpose, the whole idea of our faith, the reason why we act in faith shows that we actually believe in God. Faith in action, that is, for the rest of chapter 11, will display how faith was shown in the lives of these great heroes of faith. That faith is seen in what we do, and that what we do and how we live out our faith shows that we believe in God and believe in his promises, even if we can't see him. Notice verse 6. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. That coming to God with our questions that we just don't understand, coming to God when we don't understand, even if it is a bit accusatory like Job was, is the essence of faith. Why? Because to come to God when you don't understand means you believe he exists. Otherwise you wouldn't come to him, you go someplace else. To come to God when we don't understand, it emphasizes that we do believe in him. Both of the questions that Job and Jonah ask revolve around the idea that he is a good God who gives good things. Not only that we must draw near to him, but whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. There's an essence of that there is a good God who rewards, who gives good things to those who seek him. Jonah asks, Job asks, I've sought you, why have bad things happened to me? It's the belief that God was good or is good and that he gives good things. And Job asks, why haven't I got good things since I've followed you and done good things? In the case of Jonah, it's why do the evil continue to perish? Why does a good God allow not good things to happen to those who are good? That's his question. Both revolve around the idea of God being good. And the same questions we ask. When we ask those questions, it's under the assumption that God is good and he gives good things, that he is a good God and that he will reward us if we seek him. So to ask God the question, I don't understand why this is happening, is the essence of believing you're a good God who gives good things. I don't understand this. It's the essence of faith. That as we come to God, praying when we don't understand, we display our faith. I want us to look at how we might go about doing this. And the first is to be honest. The book of Jonah is all about trying to get Jonah to be honest about why he has done as he has done, what his true beliefs are. In the case of Job, Job is quite honest and upfront. And it is important that we are honest with God. Not because God needs to know what we're thinking. He already knows. For God examines the heart. And since he examines the heart, he already knows the questions we have, already knows the concerns that we have. The point is not so much that he knows, but rather that we acknowledge the questions that we have, that we acknowledge the honest questions that we have, even if it doesn't sound great to us. For at times, the reason why we want to not ask a question is perhaps because we're a little ashamed that we're asking the question to begin with. We're a little ashamed of what we actually think about it, that we feel as though we shouldn't feel that way. But until we acknowledge the reality that I am asking this question and I don't understand, then God can't address it. And the whole point of asking God in prayer, why is this happening? I don't understand, is so that he can address our assumptions. That's what he does with Job and with Jonah. The second is that we are to recognize that we may never know. In the case of Job, there's no record that Job ever learns about the conversations in chapter 1 and chapter 2. There's no record that Job ever comes to knowing why God chose to do what he did. Instead, the end of the book is God saying, I'm God, you're not, you're going to have to trust me. Sometimes we might not know. We might never have a good, satisfactory answer as to why things are the way they are, why things have happened as they have happened. And we have to be okay with that reality. For God can choose to reveal the answers that he desires to choose. We're also to recognize that seeking answers leads to God. For that's the same thing that happens with both Job and Jonah. In the case of Job, as he seeks God, he's going to pour out his heart, and God's going to come to him and say, you're just a man, and I'm God. You don't really know what you're talking about. And at the end, Job is going to say, man, I really didn't know what I was talking about. I repent. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what I was talking about. For even though Job never really gets an answer exactly to his question, he does come to understand more of who God is, more of God's sovereignty, more of his control. that he does find an answer, even if it wasn't exactly the answer to his question. In the case of Jonah, he too, though he gets more of a direct answer than just Job, an answer he wasn't necessarily thrilled with. For the end of the book of Jonah, it displays God's love for all people, even all of his creation. For the very last verse is God saying, am I supposed to destroy all of these people and all of those cattle? It's about God's love and how much he cares for all of humanity. And so in this, Jonah, he might not be comfortable with the answer to his question, but he still comes to learn more about who God is and the love that he has not only for Israel, but for all of creation and for all of humanity. And lastly, we are to pray while reading. Specifically, that is, we're to pray while we read our Bibles. For did you catch, as we read through Jonah and read through Job, the word of the Lord came, or God said to? Did you catch that? That it's a conversation. And it allowed God to respond to what Job and what Jonah were saying. But in our case, God doesn't so much speak verbally as he does through his word. So as we seek answers, we are to pray, looking at his word, looking at what he's already said, and asking, will you help me to see what it is that you want me to know? Help me to see the answers to these questions. Recognizing that I might not ever get the answer that I'm comfortable with. I might not even find a definitive answer. But as I go through the process of seeking those answers, I will come to understand and know him more. There was a man by the name of George Dantzig. He was a graduate student studying statistics at the University of California, Berkeley. One particular day, he was running late to class, and when he came in and sat down, there were already 2 problems up on the board. And so he jotted them down very quickly, understanding them to be homework. He listened to the rest of the lecture and went home and did his homework. And he noticed that these 2 problems were just significantly more difficult than all the other problems he'd done. And when he finally turned in his homework, he said just that to the professor, that, man, these problems seem to be so much harder than all the other problems that we had. And the professor just nodded. About 6 weeks later, George heard a knock on his door, a frantic knock on his door. And when he opened it, it was revealed to be his professor, who was clearly out of wind from running. And that professor began to express to him and relay to him how those 2 problems on the board were considered to be unsolvable problems in all the statistics. George had just missed that part of the lecture because he'd gotten late. They were unsolvable problems, or at least considered to be unsolvable problems by all of the mathematical community, and yet he had solved them. He'd solved them because he was willing to ask the question. He didn't know that they weren't unsolvable. But he was willing to ask the question where others were not willing to ask the question. And in so doing, he found answers that others had not been able to find. The same is true with our God. That we ask questions. Some questions we get good answers to. Some questions we're not comfortable with the answers. And some questions we may never have an answer at all. But as we ask those questions and are willing to ask hard questions of our God while looking at his word, we inevitably do come to find answers that we might never have expected to find and would not have found if we hadn't been willing to ask the hard questions in the first place. As we go through praying, let us make sure to pray asking difficult questions of our God. Perhaps you're here today and you want to begin a relationship with the one who loves you most. The one who sacrificed everything that you might have a relationship with him. And there's nothing that would excite us more than to help you begin that journey, which starts at baptism. Or perhaps you're here and need the prayers of the church. If there's any way we can assist you, won't you come as together we stand and sing.